Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we are finally going to be talking about the newest album from Danny Brown called Atrocity Exhibition. So here's something you probably already know by now. As a rapper and artist, I tend to like Danny Brown a fair bit. But if I'm being brutally honest, there's a part of me that likes the idea of Danny Brown and writing about Danny Brown almost more than some of his music. Most because he's a sort of fascinating artist you don't see very often anymore. His critically acclaimed breakthrough Triple X held a fascinating split for me. A rapper who could descend into depravity that was borderline cartoonish, but could also step back into more vividly detailed and conscious content. The sort of material that didn't just show a more thoughtful MC, but also provided the context to why he cut loose the way he did. That wildness was explored even more thoroughly on his 2013 follow-up, Old, which yes, I did review on this channel very early on, but outside of some harrowing darkness, the dramatic contrast felt a little bit skewed to me, and I ultimately didn't find the record as enjoyable as I was hoping. Still a good album, but not quite a great one, at least for me. But from there, Danny Brown just seemed to drift from project to project in a way that either implied he's just kind of screwing around, or that something had gotten seriously knocked loose in his brain. Aside from saying that he was writing a children's book inspired by Dr. Seuss, which, if this exists, I need to find this immediately, but he would also show up for guest verses in all sorts of odd places, and not many of them at that. From the Detroit vs. Everybody compilation that had him working with Eminem, Royce da 5'9", and Big Sean, to working with Freddie Gibbs and Madlib off a song off Pinata, to collaborating with Aesop Rock and Bus Driver. Overall, we hadn't seen a lot of Danny Brown over the past couple of years, to the point where he showed up twice on the new Avalanche's album Wildflower, including its best song opposite MF Doom, Frankie Sinatra. It was a legit surprise when he showed up, and I'll admit, it was a surprise to hear he was dropping an album this year called Atrocity Exhibition, with a new label, including a posse cut that included Kendrick, Ab-Soul, and Earl Sweatshirt, because of course it did. Much more interesting to me was the executive producer Paul White. You might recognize from earlier this year from his collaboration project with Open Mike Eagle, Hella Personal Film Festival, which remains my favorite hip-hop project of 2016. But Danny Brown seemed to be working with a lot of people and styles that I otherwise really liked, and considering this album was reportedly his most wild and eclectic to date, I had to hear it, so what did we get on this Atrocity Exhibition? Well, it was interesting, that's for sure. I can definitely say you probably won't hear a hip-hop album with production this wild and out there all year, including from Death Grips, pulling from all manner of demented niches that definitely don't remain just with hip-hop. And Danny Brown proves that he's definitely a rapper who can match it with insane energy. And yet, for as sonically bizarre as this album can be, I wish the actual content resonated with me a little bit more strongly, or actually cut into meatier subtext that Danny Brown hadn't already touched upon on Triple X or Old. Don't get me wrong, this is a great record in a year where we had a lot of great experimental hip-hop, from Death Grips to Ka, from De La Soul to LMNO, from Clipping to Detroit's own Elzai. I just wish that it took that additional step to become something truly incredible, because it really is damn close. It is a great record. So let's start off with the character that owns the stage for every second he's on here in glorious excess, Danny Brown himself. Now, I had said earlier that throughout his albums he pushed his split between cartoonish excess and a more downbeat social conscience. Just like with Triple X and Old, the split is here as well, but from the very first track, the overall tone has really shifted. Whereas previous albums, the excess had been rendered so hyperbolic to intensify some of the polarized content, here the drug abuse takes center stage, and the focus is on the word abuse. Forget any sort of potent glorification of this lifestyle that might have crept onto Old. Danny Brown is embodying the addict who is careening so far out of control that the sense of dread begins in earnest right from the first song. And the fact that Danny Brown is such a nakedly expressive rapper only intensifies that feeling. He might establish on Tell Me What I Don't Know in his lower tones the roots of his neuroses, but his wild squawk of a voice across this album shows just how far he is on that edge, right up to the borderline overdose of white lines. And yet he has just enough sense to twist back into perspective for the much darker final third of this album, where he highlights the poverty, the violence, and the loneliness and empty debauchery that explains why he's constantly craving that escape right now, cheating death one too many times, even before the end, where he refocuses and vows to give a living hell to those who saw his rock star downward spiral and thus discounted him. Because all throughout this album, he's just spitting across dozens of flows, proving able to mimic rappers from Schoolboy Q to Andre 3000 to Lupe Fiasco. Now, I will reiterate that I've never been a fan of how often he forces rhymes here, but outside of places where the bars can feel a tad basic, even though that's kind of the point across the crazed OD of white lines to the driving dance in the water, he is a potent ass as hell rapper and a really fantastic expressive performer, and it helps so much that this album is laser focused on his claustrophobic wall of mirrors, with very few guest stars that manage to interrupt. The one big exception here is the posse track Really Doe with Absol, Kendrick Lamar, and Earl Sweatshirt, which really doesn't quite fit in with the arc of the album if I'm being honest, but it's such a damn solid cut that you almost won't care, with Earl probably walking away with the best punchlines, even though Danny Brown has his own utterly hilarious bars. Really did like his verse there. The other guest stars handle a few hooks and really do a strikingly solid job, between Kelela singing on the Muted from the Ground, to the twisted rock star soul of Rolling Stone from Petite Noir, to the borderline Chipper Hayes of Be Real from Cypress Hill on his song Get High. But you know what? Enough beating around it. What will inevitably attract the most attention is the production on this thing, which is easily some of the most eclectic and experimental you will see in hip-hop in 2016, while still maintaining coherent melodic hooks. And what gets kind of fascinating is how little Danny Brown pulls from modern trap-influenced hip-hop trends, instead touching into sounds that mirror his mix of depression and coked-up insanity. So take a song like Golddust, with the busy drum line and the smolder of guitars that builds to the end of the hook. It's got this thin blast of horn, and yet it's also a song that samples Joy Division of all things. And that garish contrast creates such a delirious funhouse effect that's honestly a little bit disorienting, and it can be tricky to focus on specific elements and songs that work for you, especially considering how much of this operates as full force at all times to the horns and that clanking textured percussion. Rolling Stone has its whistle counterbalanced by the stalking bass guitar. The dirtier beat courtesy of Black Milk on Really Doe is matched by a xylophone melody that tinkles through. Ain't It Funny is overloaded with horns and compression that still manages to break into a pretty thunderous groove, a trend that would later be echoed on the shredded bass and shrill jangling squawks that characterize When It Rained, or the most immediately memorable melody on this album that coming through in the closer with a sharper piano on Hell For It. And then you get the moments where the freak house vibe gets all the more pronounced, like the ramshackle horn-drenched mess that seems to imply sort of desperate freedom on White Lines, or the blissed out sandy cymbals of Get High with the watery guitars around the hook. Honestly, where the album feels the most accessible are probably the Schoolboy QS touches with the cacophonous percussion on Pneumonia, or the dense borderline dancehall feel of Dance in the Water with the female backing vocals, a tactic that's kind of a lot more creepy on Lost, with the soulful but very clipped vocal sample, the shrill synths, and the blast of trumpet. Honestly, as a collection of sound that Danny Brown could somehow ride, I'll give Atrocity Exhibition a lot of points for sheer uniqueness. But now we've got to get to the content, and the area where I wish I really could get behind a lot more of this album. As I described earlier, so much of this record plays out like a coked out abuse of substances, stripping away the glamour and focusing much more on the addiction that underscores it and the mental instability, before then delving into the hollow rationale beneath it, half the hellhole of inner city Detroit and half some of Danny Brown's own natural predisposition to this sort of hedonistic abuse, which even as a form of escape begins to feel all the more hollow. There's some pathos there, and for the wild ride itself, it's a harrowing listen, as you're left wondering where and when he's going to hit that wall. But this is where you also realize that Danny Brown, he really has touched into a lot of these topics and themes plenty of times before across Triple X and Old, and outside of presenting a frighteningly real portrait of what this sort of life might really entail, it doesn't really go beyond that into deeper insight. What's more, as much as I really do like the ending song, Hell For It, I'm not quite sure his annoyance of being judged for his drug abuse has a lot of justification. I get not appreciating this sort of rap for its creativity and visceral insight, a lot of people probably won't, but for as many drugs are abused on this album and how reckless he becomes, I can definitely see why some would be a little bit skeptical, especially considering there are more than a few songs on this record that aren't quite as framed with the sort of insight that would temper or add more context to the whole debauchery here, or step up to the level of some tracks from Triple X or Old, at least for me. But that being said, I am inclined to support this album, if only because it is absolutely insane with the sort of half-mad genius that works far more often than it doesn't. I don't quite think it's as strong as Triple X, if I'm being honest, but doesn't have any of the compromising moments of Olds, and as such for me, it's a light 8 out of 10. I can definitely say this will not be for everyone, but you know what? You're on board with Danny Brown's unique vocal style, you'd probably be ready for the deranged twist the production will take. Otherwise, well, it certainly is a challenging hip-hop album, but a pretty damn great one all the same. So yeah, check this out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. Like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I got the poll up here. I'm a little bit curious where you guys will fall on this Danny Brown album. Did the riotous production and as experimental as it is, did it get to you? Is it what you really were waiting for? Or just a little bit too over the edge for some of you guys? Because I can see this album kind of tipping one way or the other. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, and any other albums, okay, I've got so many on my schedule, not taking requests anymore. Just be patient, I got a lot coming. Till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.